recorded. There is a Q&A function if you want to put questions in the chat and people can respond to them. So yeah, welcome to the Communist Party's Manifesto launch for the general election next month. It's titled Vote Communist for Workers' Rights, Public Ownership and Peace-Free Palestine. And we have an array of panelists tonight from all walks of life in the Labour and Progressive movement. We'll be hearing from Lorraine Douglas, Helen O'Connor, Nathan Hennebury, Judith Cazorla and Robert Griffiths. And I'll try to aim to finish no later than 8:30. So thank you all for coming. So our first speaker is Lorraine Douglas. She is a member of the Executive Committee of the Communist Party, and she will also be standing against Liz Truss in South West Norfolk. Lorraine, take it away.
Thanks, Georgina. And as you said, I'm standing for the Communist Party in South West Norfolk. It's the seat, you might be aware, that is currently held by Liz Truss. So I thought I'd bring some lettuces along with me today. And it's true, I stand against everything that she stands for. I've been reading her book, so most of you don't need to. It's hubristically titled 10 Years to Save the West. Having ploughed through most of it, I'd say a better title would have been My Struggle, since she spends the 300 pages plus describing herself as a victim of technocrats, administrators and vested interests, which worked to stop her doing what she wanted, apparently, in every government position she held. I've described the book as a love letter to the anarchy of unfettered capitalism and a death sentence for what is left of the welfare state. So what is the difference between me and Lettuce Liz? Well, on Palestine, she declares her full support for Israel. She wanted to move the British embassy to Jerusalem, aping her hero, the Donald, as she calls him in the book. Bizarrely, she claims that what she calls the British establishment and Foreign Office are more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israel, apparently with no hint of irony. I, on the other hand, stand four square with the Palestinian people for an immediate end to the slaughter in Gaza and a release of all hostages, Palestinian and Israeli. Ban the sale of arms to Israel, and I support the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign against Israel and call for international economic, trade and cultural sanctions until it complies with the successive UN resolutions on ending the occupation and blockade. I support the immediate recognition of the state of Palestine. Liz Truss favours what she calls small government, low taxes and cutting public spending. She believes that the free market is the solution to Britain's economic problems, apparently oblivious to the fact that the free market has been operating with virtually no regulation for the best part of 40 years. The word austerity doesn't appear in her book, nor for that matter does the NHS or social care. Her only mention of pensions is to attack the economic establishment for not warning her or Kwarteng that pension funds were overinvested in liability-driven investments, which threatened to bankrupt the country after her disastrous budget, and for which she blamed the Bank of England's response. In a passage beyond irony, she bemoans the lack of financial regulation that enabled the pension fund managers to gamble on low interest rates, apparently a phenomenon which Liz, the accountant, and her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwarteng, had never heard of. I, on the other hand, know that the British state is on the verge of collapse because of austerity. There have been real terms cuts of up to 40% in local governments since 2010. Councils are going bankrupt and are no longer able to fulfil their statutory duties in social care, education, environmental health, or housing and homelessness. We're seeing libraries and other community buildings being sold off to developers and the closure of leisure facilities across the country. The crisis in social care, which has now been almost completely privatised, means that the most vulnerable people in society have effectively been cut adrift and left to fend for themselves. The benefits system has stopped providing a safety net for the poorest people in society, and so we see children going to school hungry and malnourished, with the Victorian poverty diseases of rickets and scurvy making a reappearance in 21st century Britain. The private sector is unable to meet the needs of the population, whether it's the failure to meet the government's offer of free childcare or the inability to recruit enough care workers to support people with disabilities. Until we have need of a service or financial support from the benefit system, we don't know how bad the situation is. In the meantime, elderly people are left for hours in soiled clothes and bedding without food or drink. Parents of disabled children unable to access the health, education and social care they desperately need. People suffering mental illness without support. Disabled people forced to jump through humiliating hoops to access the benefits they should be entitled to. The mark of a civilised country is how well it supports its most vulnerable citizens. And I say that we in Britain are descending into barbarism. The Communist Party recognises the importance of public services, both in meeting the needs of the vulnerable and in providing services that enrich our society and enhance our public realm. As the Royal College of Nursing has pointed out today, the NHS is in a state of emergency. Hospitals are in crisis. Primary care is not meeting the needs and failing in its role to prevent ill health. There is virtually no NHS dental provision in the whole of Norfolk, with dentists walking away from their NHS contracts across Britain. Mental health services in Norfolk are among the worst in Britain. And since Andrew Lansley's act of vandalism in 2012, the pace of privatisation has increased. Today, over 80% of passenger ambulance services are now run by the private sector. More than 600 GP surgeries have been bought up by private healthcare firms, including American health insurance companies. The diagnostic hubs trumpeted by Rishi Sunak are run by private companies, and many other services previously provided by the NHS have either been outsourced or just closed completely. The Communist Party stands for a publicly owned, publicly run and accountable NHS that will meet the needs of the population. Every penny of private profit paid by the NHS is money stolen from patient care. We support a workforce plan that includes abolishing tuition fees, reinstating the nursing bursary and writing off student debt to help train and retain medical staff rather than poaching them from abroad. Liz Truss's love of the free market presumably extends to a belief that it will run the NHS better than if it remains publicly owned. In reality, privatisation of what remains of our public services is the last refuge for a decaying capitalist system that is locked in a spiral of crisis caused by overproduction, increased exploitation, and the immiseration of the working class. Communists say it's time to end the profiteering, renationalise rail, mail, energy and water, reverse the privatisations of the NHS and other public services, nationalise the banks and bring the Bank of England back under political control. We need to reinstate proper regulation of the financial sector, stop the endemic corruption exposed during the scandalous waste of public funds during the COVID fiasco, and get back the billions conned out of the British people by the crooks and charlatans handed contracts they were uniquely unqualified to deliver. Thatcher turned Britain from an industrial, productive economy to one which is overly dependent on the parasitic finance sector. Communists stand for investment in manufacturing and the development of an industrial strategy that will address our domestic skills shortage, create high quality apprenticeships and skilled jobs that will once again turn Britain into a country that makes stuff. This means using our independence from the EU to save our steel industry and develop our infrastructure to make us fit for the future. Truss claims to support women's sex-based rights and the provision of affordable childcare, at a time when violence against women might as well be legal, given the abject failure of the criminal justice system to protect women from domestic violence and misogyny. The promise that free childcare will be extended to all 2-year-olds has not been met with a funding commitment, so private nurseries will not deliver on the promise. As a WASPy woman, I've lost around £48,000 in state pension because of the increase in the retirement age, and I'm not happy about it. Communists stand for an end to state-sanctioned misogyny, reducing the retirement age to 60 and a properly funded universal childcare system that will free women to study and work full-time. Truss spends a lot of her time attacking wokery in her book and attacking the left, undefined and unexplained. She talks a lot about British values, while at the same time praising the legacy of empire. As Ben Chacko pointed out in today's Morning Star, the far right is growing in strength across Europe, a movement to which the Tories have cleaved since Cameron took the Tories into the hard right European Conservatives and Reformist bloc in the EU in 2009, so aligning them with fascistic and extreme nationalistic parties. Truss in this book shows herself to be cut from the same cloth, parroting every right-wing trope peddled by the likes of the odious Carl Benjamin, whose Lotus Eaters group Truss is now turning to for publicity, as a result of which there are calls for Sunak to kick her out of the Tory party. I won't hold my breath. Her irony bypass looms large when talking about her support for free speech. Presumably, she would defend Benjamin's right to muse about whether he would rape Jess Phillips or proclaim his love of racist jokes. Meanwhile, she says that ethical investment companies should be denied access to government contracts, so free speech only extends to people who agree with her. She opposes immigration and regards refugees forced to use unauthorised routes to seek asylum as illegal immigrants, enthusiastic in her support for the Rwanda scheme. We say stop scapegoating refugees and migrant workers, oppose racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and let's fight this crude racist attempt to divide the working class. Our young people have been frozen out of the housing market. Homelessness has reached epidemic levels, while buy-to-let landlords rake in the profits from former council homes now let at, on average, 3 times the council rent. Local people have no real say over what gets built in their neighbourhoods. We're told there's a housing shortage when over 250,000 homes have been empty for more than 6 months, and 1 million homes in this country are either second homes or let as Airbnbs. We don't need any more estates of executive-style homes. We need genuinely affordable council homes built en masse to replace those lost under the right to buy and to meet the needs of all those who can't afford a market rent or a mortgage in the overheated private sector. We want rent controls and proper regulation of the private rented sector and an end to no-fault evictions. We need to see local democracy re-energised, regional assemblies to play a strategic role in planning and delivery of major projects and infrastructure. We need to restore local government and increase accountability to local communities. We also need a green revolution, public ownership, planning and investment of the transition from fossil fuels to renewables, and a food strategy. Let's get Britain self-sufficient in food again. If we could do it in World War II, we should be able to do it in the 21st century. And let's ensure that our farmers can afford to make a living from food production. Peace has to be the most important issue of the day. In addition to working with our international partners to end the slaughter in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, we need to convert arms production to peaceful purposes. We should be adopting an independent foreign policy, withdrawing from NATO and the new Cold War against China. When we hear Liz Truss talking about the tactical use of nuclear weapons, repeated by Keir Starmer today, we know the time has come to get rid of them altogether before our politicians lead us into mutually assured destruction. Capitalism is the problem. Socialism is the solution. And if you get the chance, vote communist on July the 4th. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lorraine. Brilliantly summarised our policies going into general election. So our next speaker is Helen O'Connor, who is a trade unionist and a member of the executive committee. Helen.
Thanks very much, Georgina, and thanks for inviting me to speak. I worked as a nurse in the NHS for 28 years, and I think there's a real need to understand the history of cuts and privatisation of the public sector, which always has a very heavy human cost. And we have to be very clear and very truthful when we're discussing privatisation. It is the case that the NHS and councils and schools used to function well, even up to a decade ago. The NHS used to be run by doctors and nurses. Everybody who needed a bed had a bed within 4 hours. Injuries were treated quickly. Lives were saved. The NHS wasn't perfect, but it was a safe service back then. And all this changed in the 90s when business people, friends of government ministers were put in charge, and the clinicians who cared about the patients were gradually sidelined over several years. The care of the patient was shifted out from being central to the NHS as business methods were adopted. Ideology was used to prop up these changes. False messages were put out that people were abusing services, that some people, particularly the poor and the more vulnerable, were somehow undeserving. And the idea that private service provision was good and public was bad was launched and widely accepted. And we were told that the NHS was lumbering, it was inefficient and not modern enough. Lies were spread that people were turning up when they didn't need services. And this was the justification to shut down and downgrade A&E departments in particular. The outsourcing of the ancillary staff, the porters, the cleaners, the catering staff started at the same time. And restructures became commonplace across the NHS and public services to bring in the so-called mixed model of service provision and to bring in the private sector right into the heart of our public services and our NHS. The general public and workers were given the impression that privatization will improve things or rescue failing services. As communists, we have to make the point that there is no such thing as good privatization ever. We in the unions know services are deliberately cut back and transformed into profit spinners by private companies. Wherever privatization occurs, whether it's the outsourcing of hospital cleaning, the academization of schools, councils setting up wholly owned subsidiaries, or commissioning services from the private sector, we, the public, and those working on the front line delivering those services will suffer a detriment. We end up with less services, worse services, services that are harder to access, like getting an appointment for treatment in the NHS right now, for example. Who would ever have thought, even 15 years ago, that the gateways to NHS treatment, the A&E, the GP, would be almost completely shut? Every single public service in this country has been hollowed out to the point they're now unable to function. As Lorraine said, and has been mentioned, the NHS is now in a state of emergency. Councils are going bankrupt. Schools can't even keep the heating on in winter or provide the most basic materials for the education of children. This has not happened by accident. It's happened by design. Services are crippled, not because the population is growing or getting older or all of the other excuses used. It's because the profiteers are getting the ear of government. They're calling the shots and they're being enabled to shake everything up to get their hands on public money. This is all the real life impact of decades of cuts to the NHS, the public sector, business methods being adopted, and private companies moving in. The NHS and the public services could and should be commissioned for the needs of the communities they serve. The public should be entitled to healthcare, education, secure housing. These are all rights, they're not privileges. Now we see hospitals being deliberately left to fall into a state of disrepair to justify shutting down wards and throwing public money into constructing new buildings. NHS and council services being merged, shrunk, moved, renamed to confuse the public so that they get fed up with the endless fight to get what they need for themselves and their families. Croydon Council, where I live, cannot even provide temporary housing for homeless people anymore. Assaults on frontline staff are on the rise because desperate people can't get the help they need. It's now the case in some parts of this country that people can't even drink the water anymore. They're falling ill because they're drinking the water. So the most basic necessities for human life are being compromised by privatization, and no one in this country will escape the impact of privatization. It's simply staggering that any politician can get away with suggesting that the cuts in privatization that are destroying the NHS and all of our public services and utilities are some sort of progressive solution to its problems. Some people are suggesting this. When it comes to the conditions of workers, whether it's hospital cleaners being outsourced, teaching assistants being transferred to multi-academy trusts, they all suffer under the private companies. Some of these companies won't even recognize trade unions, and a sort of a Wild West situation opens up when it comes to employment rights. Workers' contractual rights, their hourly pay rates, sick pay, holidays, all get eroded, and the rights for new hires to have a permanent contract and secure hours will be ended. Even the right to a pay slip, to dignity at work, the right to a break, the right to be paid in full and on time, the right to sick pay, maternity leave, all of the sacred cows get killed when the private sector takes over a public sector contract. Even the right to be treated fairly as a worker, to benefit from fair processes. Things have now developed to a point where it's actually unusual to see a private company in this country doing the right thing by its workforce. And if you look at the host employers, the NHS and the councils, doctors, nurses, and others went from having secure, stable jobs for life with decent conditions and prospects of promotion to being deliberately de-skilled. They're ending up far poorer, more at risk of precarious contracts, downgrading, and redundancy. Workloads have increased across the board. Vacancies aren't being filled. And these days, doctors and nurses are finishing training. They can't even get jobs. The vacancies are there, but the funding isn't being put in to fill the vacancies. So cuts and privatization and the corruption that goes along with it has become deeply embedded across public services, due in part to a historical lack of a coordinated fight back across the movement. The defeat suffered by the unions over the last couple of years, most noticeably the miners' strike, did strip confidence out of the labour movement, and ideas of new realism were adopted, which simply meant we can't stop cuts and privatisation. There's no alternative to capitalism. We must work in partnership and appeal to the good nature of the bosses and the ruling class. But all that happened is further cuts, service redesigns and modernisation continued. But we're now in a period where things are so bad that workers and others are realising that they've no choice but to fight back. And the increase in industrial action in this country is a reflection of the mood of the country. And that genie will not go into the bottle. So there's many opportunities for us to push back via the unions against what's going on. And what we need is coordination right across the movement and around the correct set of political demands that reflect the needs and wishes of working class people. And I would go so far as to say that there's no mainstream political party in this country that has a program that reflects the interests of people I deal with, the hospital cleaners, the bin men, the shop workers and others. So our movement must organise both politically and industrially, because there's no doubt that cuts and privatisation will not just be continued, they will be ramped up. And working class people want rid of the Tories. So the need for organisation, resistance and fight back will very much continue. And we have to be prepared to lead the resistance to it as communists. So any fight back needs to be organised, as I said, around the correct political demands. Lorraine went into them at length in her speech, but we need to end all and reverse all outsourcing, proper workers' rights, full contractual sick pay, free education, a real living wage, a significant pay rise for all public sector workers and all workers, and universal credit as well to be overhauled, decent housing. There'll be no stability for the capitalist class, and they know it. The current material hardships that people are going through will set the conditions to build the fight for a political alternative, and that alternative can only be a socialist alternative. It won't happen by magic, comrades. We have to fight for its solidarity.
Thank you, Helen. I think that's really important, especially in terms of young people who've lived under privatisation all their lives. They don't remember anything else, and showing alternatives, socialist public ownership to young people is really important in this general election. So our next speaker is Nathan Hennebury. He's a young trade unionist and the YCR's environmental officer, and he will be standing in Clydebank. Nathan?
Thanks, Georgina. So I'm Nathan Hennebury, as Georgina's already said. I'm a young trade unionist. I'm actually the chair for GMB Scotland's Young Workers Network. I'm the vice convener for GMB in my workplace, as well as a branch secretary. And I'll be standing in the Clydebank by-election for the local council. Coming off what Lorraine and Helen have already stated, it's the continued message that I'm getting as I'm going out, door knocking, canvassing, everything. Cuts, cuts and cuts. This is the new status quo that's happening across Britain. It's not just systemic to England, to Scotland or Wales. This is a continuing trend of cuts ravaging our local councils. Now, these cuts are a conscious choice taken by council and at national government level. And this has played part in tandem, especially here in Scotland, with the council tax system. Some would continuously say that this system is broken, but I'm on the other hand saying it's working exactly as intended, from the likes that Helen's highlighted. The continued liquidisation of our government, council-run and controlled services directly into the hands of private profiteers, and it's putting profit over people. This is how we see vital services absolutely demolished over the course of a few years, not just within care, not just within the NHS, but anything, even public transport. Clydebank has been decimated, like many other councils, as a result of Tory cuts, SNP incompetence, as well as Labour's incompetence from its past administrations. And they're now being led to believe their Labour lies is being peddled forward as a safeguard from protection of any other cuts, while simultaneously other Labour councillors across Scotland have been implementing cuts and voting for cuts, yet we're told that they're going to be the saviours for local democracy. What we do see across Clydebank as well is a housing crisis, and this is the same across Scotland, England and Wales. All the problems I'm going to talk about that are afflicting Clydebank are happening in England and Wales as well. Not too far from Clydebank, just over in the Wynford, we're seeing social landlords exploiting local communities, threatening to demolish over 600 socially rented homes, replacing them with half the homes at double the price. In no way, shape, or form is that a housing strategy that comes close to dealing with the material needs of the people within the Wynford. It actually deals with the needs from people outside it. This is a means of gentrification, absolutely washing working class people from without their communities through price hikes. At the same pat in the back strategy, we'll see governments give themselves a pat in the back by saying they've met their quota of building these amount of houses while simultaneously knocking them down, spiking homelessness, affecting the attitudes and the market strategies of private landlords who are ravaging the rest of Britain as well. Tenants unions from the likes of Live and Rent to Acorn will tell you the same thing. The same stories they get are absolutely disgusting living conditions, bully tactics from landlords, and a rise in price across the board, putting people, working people like us, once again fighting for resources, and we're having to fight with each other. Now, this fight for resources well comes with Britain's international policies as well, as kind of highlighted from Lorraine, touching off Liz Truss. Refugees and asylum seekers have been laid as the scapegoats for the ongoing crisis, but we know the ongoing cost of living crisis is in fact a cost of capitalism crisis, and those profiting from it are the capitalist class itself, those who are making the money from leasing out their contracts in hotels to house asylum seekers, to cause instability within our communities. This all to rile and ravage tensions within our communities. And again, it puts us fighting with each other here domestically, as well as the workers internationally also. This leaves a massive gap for the far right to really nuzzle into. And it's a gap we've seen them try to nuzzle into across Britain. We've seen it in Liverpool, the attacks in hotels of asylum seekers, and up here in Scotland as well. It's been the same tiresome rhetoric, the same tiresome slogans. But what I will applaud from a left perspective has been the effort made by trade unionists, socialists, members of the Communist Party here in mobilising in support for workers internationally who found themselves in our countries. And when we've actually talked to these asylum seekers, the stories that they tell us are the fact that they've been displaced as a direct result of Britain's foreign policy and causing instability and conflict across the globe. Yet we're told that these issues are not interlinked. We're told that this is just part and parcel. But we say no to that. What an absolute lie that's meant to lull people into believing any kind of Tory lie that's put forward on international policy today with borders and immigration. What we also see, again, part and parcel with that, is the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our councils are being ravaged. I touched on that just in the start. Billions of pounds is being shifted thousands of miles across the globe. So-called military aid, munitions, bombs, air defence systems, everything. Our communities are ravished from millions of pounds. Instead, it's been laid into the hands, laid into the pockets, laid into the very laps of arms dealers, such as BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, all playing in tandem with NATO's proxy war against China. Now, many people will say that how can these international issues be linked to what's going on at home? Or many people won't be as attracted to the ongoing issues in Palestine and Ukraine. But we say to the workers, these are directly linked. The money that should be going to your councils is going to CEOs of BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin. Your communities are being deprived, and it's at a cost to these businessmen, ensuring their bonuses, ensuring their quarterly salaries. And it's a conscious choice that we're going to continue to highlight, whether it's the conflict raging on between Russia and Ukraine, or whether it's Britain's complicity in supplying Israel with what it needs to genocide the people of Palestine. Either way, we're not going to stand for it. And we draw that direct link to what it means for our communities here as well. When we see no cuts for council spending, for the cuts that we're seeing ravaging our local communities, this isn't just based off nothing. Like I've said, these are conscious choices. Here in Scotland, we're already going to be backing, as part of my campaign, backing a zero cuts budget, because that's what we need. It's not driven from the air. It's not plucked from any magic tree. This is STUC policy, zero cuts. We draw this lesson not just from our own ideas, but from the lived experiences from those working within the council, from those working within care, from those working within the cleansing industry, that tell us the damaging effect that these cuts are having. Now, Helen touched on it earlier in her speech about restructuring, and it's never restructuring within the councils or local government for the sake of efficiency, for the sake of service. It's restructuring for the sake of profit. Continuous, time and time again, restructuring so the managers get more, whilst workers slowly see their wages eroded throughout time. This is already an issue I'm dealing with as a shop steward within the private sector for where I work in the whisky industry. Pay erosion over years and years that we're fighting against. So this continued trend we're already seeing within our local councils and wherever our workers are working privately. Also, transport, as I've touched on, has been taken away from us. The government has continued to ignore trade unions. The RMT and ASLEF, who are already highlighted the damaging effects that privatisation has in our services. And when these private companies take hold, they're not looking to provide a service. They're looking to make money. They're looking for profit. They're looking for ways to cut. I couldn't think of anywhere more dangerous to do that within our transport sectors, especially for our most vulnerable, the slashing of bus routes. We're seeing our trains and our rail services decimated. The RMT continuing to highlight the dangers of privatisation and cuts to our railway, with our actual rail lines not being kept up to standard. And we're at risk, once again, of another disastrous rail catastrophe. Now, I could go on for a while, but the 12 points that we're seeing within the manifesto launched by the party, these are the real needs of the workers in Britain. These are the real needs that impact every local council within Britain in itself. All good us saying it. The most important thing that the party does and goes out there and fights for it. We build a popular front. It's not just within ourselves. It's not just within our branches, our own mobilisations. It's working with the trade unions. It's working with the tenants unions, local trades councils, community campaigners. If there's somebody using a service, that is somebody to draw to a campaign that we aim to build upon. Foundation and building it higher and higher every single time. It's one of the key things that's drawn me into the party. I joined probably about 3 years ago. Best decision I've ever made. The party has been the only group consistently to stay true to its message in building a popular front. No dogma, no sectarianism, continued development and analysis that's led us to this 12-point manifesto, and it's going to lead us beyond it. And I know it can lead us beyond it because I know there's excellent comrades dedicated both in the party and those who circle out with, who continue to build on a popular front. So if there's one thing to take away from today, thinking about voting communist, having a look at who's in your local area, the one thing to do from it, great. Putting down a vote, fantastic. Even better, continue that struggle forward. Stay in touch with those in the party within your local area. If you're feeling up to the task, apply to join the party. If you're successful, be the change that you want to see. The one piece of phrase that was given to me that continues to kind of inspire me for the course of this campaign, the general election and everything else in between is, if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? And that saying couldn't be any more important in an era of continued cuts, privatisation, and ongoing escalation to war. So I'll just finish in a very simple message of vote communist, vote for real change.
Thank you, Nathan. And thank you for drawing the links between international, national, and local issues. So our next speaker, Judith Karzula, she is an organiser and a member of the Communist Party's Executive Committee.
Hi, comrades. Thank you very much for all the speeches. Have been great so far. Comrades, I'm going to be quite brief in my intervention. These general elections could mean the end of the Tory rule for more than 10 years. As our Congress decided, a Labour victory might be preferable than another Conservative government. However, we shall not forget what Labour has turned it into by their leadership. And we must put the Labour and anyone in these forthcoming elections the much pressure into accountability from the left. We have the responsibility to stand strong for the working class and build a united front. Nonetheless, and most importantly, we are standing in over 10 constituencies, comrades. Our manifesto is not only a leaflet for those comrades and areas where we stand. It is crucial right now for the party as a whole to take the streets back. Our party, as the comrades have already stated, our party represents the working class, that working people who is willing to take a step forward for our rights to decent housing, for our defense to the NHS and public services, to live a good life without austerity measures and good living and working conditions. We defend the right to strike. We defend women's rights. And we defend a system where democracy is in the best interest of the workers. We defend a war without imperialism, without NATO-imposed policies where our public funds go to finance arms against the working people of the world. But now, comrades, it's time for us to organize and agitate in our communities, in our workplace, in our high streets, in our markets. Its secretary from the party has received manifesto leaflets. What we want is for you, comrades, to plan your own activities, even if you have candidates standing or not, in the Red Weekend. We want to ensure all branches, districts, and or nations to organize party events on the 22nd, 23rd, 29th, and 30th of June. Any sort of social event will be useful, from a leafleting in our high streets or market squares to public meetings and social gatherings. Our main aim is to organize in at least most of the cities, towns, and villages for the party and for the working class. It is our huge chance to get to the grassroots of our localities and communities to raise the red flag very, very high, comrades. And to finalize, it was shorter than I thought. To finalize, I would like to remember part of our political resolutions approved last November, which as well, you can get these in our shop. And it says, whichever party or coalition forms the British government, a stronger and more influential Communist Party will, together with a militant united front, be essential in order to help provide a strategy and direction for the working class movement and the left. That is why the communists will contest as many constituencies in the forthcoming general election as resources allowed in order to raise the red flag for public ownership, public sector housing, a wealth tax, price and capital controls, an end to fossil fuel exploitation in the transition to clean and green energy, the repeal of all racist and anti-unions law, progressive federalism, nuclear disarmament, and opposition to NATO. Comrades, we have the chance to vote for communists this 4th of July. So Raise your head, raise your red flags high, and solidarity.
Thank you. And yeah, if there's one thing that you think about after this meeting is the practical steps that you're going to take to your localities in the coming month. So our last speaker is Rob Griffiths, is the General Secretary of the Communist Party and is also standing for election in Blaenau Gwent. Rob?
Thanks very much, Georgina. And I've enjoyed listening to the previous contributions. And I've been busy crossing out some parts of my speech because I might not even say it as well as it's been said. I think it's been particularly impressive the way in which the links have been drawn between our foreign policy and military policy. We like to call it defence, of course. Here in Britain, it's always defence, although what it is we're defending is not very clear, other than the overseas interests usually of British big business. But the links are very important and they're so easily overlooked. I'll just give one example off the top of my head, really. We had the British armed forces, in particular the Air Force, in action in the Middle East recently. They were shooting down rockets, not the rockets aimed at the civilian population of Gaza, of course. They were shooting down rockets heading for Israel, and at the same time, we were bombing one of the world's very poorest.
Rob, we can't hear you very well. You need to be speaking into your mic.
Right, sorry. I thought I was, but let's see if I can do it a little more clearly. Yes, I was talking about the British Armed Forces going into action just a short time ago, not to rescue, not to defend or rescue the massacred people of Gaza, but to defend Israel and to bomb one of the world's poorest countries, Yemen. What was not publicized, of course, was just how much that cost. Just to bring down one rocket aimed for Israel. We are talking hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions of pounds each single time. And all of that is money that could be spent otherwise here in Britain and to help some of the world's poorest people in different parts of the world. But the cost of our military preparations, our military exercises, the cost, not just the financial cost, but the environmental cost is rarely, if ever, discussed. But as communists, we are intending to do all that we can to make these important questions part of the domestic debate. We held our 57th Congress last year, shortly after the Hamas attack on Israel. We, of course, as we would always do, we condemned the targeting and killing of masses of civilians by military forces, and therefore we condemned that Hamas attack. It was not clear what, if anything, it was meant to achieve, certainly that would be in the interests of the Palestinian people. But also, by the time our Congress took place, we saw what the response, the very predictable response, it has to be said, would be from the State of Israel. And that was a brutal bombardment of villages, towns, and cities, the wiping out of whole parts of Gaza, which is near completion now, and the mass murder of dozens of tens of thousands of innocent civilians. And what's more, this genocidal attack on the Palestinian national community in Gaza, of course, thanks to the brave efforts of so many journalists and film crews and so on, we can see, we've seen these attacks, they've taken place in front of our eyes. We have seen the obliteration of universities. We have seen the destruction, the military destruction of hospitals. And of course, no human being should be able to stand back from this and fail to condemn it in the strongest terms and campaign for it to be brought to an end. So we condemned the initial attack. We condemned the response from Israel, the genocidal response from Israel. We're also well aware, of course, that all of this didn't begin in a vacuum. It arises from the fact that the Palestinian people have had their rights removed. They are denied the opportunity to live as a free people. They're under foreign occupation by Israel that has been condemned by the United Nations for close on 60 years. And yet Britain and the Western powers not only stand by and do nothing, even worse, they arm the oppressors. They arm the genocidal power in Palestine by exporting weapons that enable the misnamed Israeli Defense Force to continue its slaughter of thousands of Palestinian people. And therefore, we not only express our solidarity with the people of Palestine, we do everything we can to support the broad popular campaigns that demand an end to the military destruction of Gaza, an end to the genocidal attacks, the withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from all Palestinian territories, not just Gaza, but the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We demand the liberation of all hostages and prisoners. Of course, that includes the Israeli hostages taken by Hamas, but it must also include the many thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. Most of them have never even been tried. They've never been subjected to any legal judicial process at all. They have simply been seized and incarcerated, taken to Israel and incarcerated. So we demand all of those things. And we also demand the right of the Palestinian people scattered around the world to return to their homeland. It's only when we see a free and sovereign Palestine, a secure Palestinian state, alongside, yes, a secure Israeli state, but it's only when we see that solution that there can be a just peace in the Middle East. We're also acutely aware that there's been another war, another devastating war, destroying many innocent lives in Ukraine since February 2022. And once more, the Communist Party from the outset condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we were also aware that that too did not begin in a vacuum. That came after 20 years of eastwards expansion of NATO, of Western powers establishing military facilities and arming very right-wing governments in most cases in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and breaking the pledges that had been given to Russian leaders that following the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not expand closer to the borders of Russia. So once again, we call for a permanent ceasefire. We call for a permanent just settlement. We support, in fact, the kind of peace proposals that have been put forward by China, by Brazil, by South Africa, proposals that have received very, very little publicity here in Britain. And that's because the Western powers, with Britain very much to the fore, are not interested in a peace settlement in Ukraine. They are doing everything possible to keep this war going and, in fact, to escalate it with huge exports of weapons to Ukraine, instead of urging all parties to cease the military conflict and to sit down and discuss a permanent solution. Why is Britain constantly drawn into these wars, these conflicts? Why are British warships and British warplanes sailing all around the coast of China, for example? Why are they in these straits between Taiwan and China? Why are they in the South China Sea? And British involvement in these conflicts in different parts of the world usually making the situation, whether we're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, making the situation far, far worse than it was before British and Western powers decided to intervene. Why is this happening? Well, again, these things don't happen in a vacuum. This is part of a long story. In fact, going all the way back to the original Cold War after the end of the Second World War and the establishment of NATO, 6 years, incidentally, before the response from the Soviet Union and its allies to set up the Warsaw Pact. We are locked into, in fact, listening to Keir Starmer just yesterday, he wants to ensure that we are triple locked into NATO and the military and political leadership of the United States of America, the country that has bombed and invaded and occupied more countries around the world than any other, times 10 since 1945. And that's why communists say we have to bring this to an end. Everything is being done by the leadership of NATO, the President of the United States, and the next President of the United States, whoever it may turn out to be. Everything is being done to whip up a war psychosis. We have to look and we have to see enemies everywhere. We have to prepare for a post-peace world, to quote some Western political leaders. People really need to see how dangerous this is and where this course can end. And that's why, again, it's a central plank of the Communist Party's platform in this general election that Britain should withdraw from NATO, that we should have an independent foreign and defence policy, not a policy made in the White House or the Pentagon, not a policy made in the boardrooms of our hugely subsidized and utterly corrupt armaments companies, not a policy made in Brussels by the NATO-EU partnership, but a policy made here. We had a lot of talk in this general election about British values. It's never very clear what is unique about any values they may be talking about, but unfortunately, British values don't seem to include having a foreign policy that pursues peace, that talks of cooperation, that talks of assisting those countries and peoples much less fortunate than ourselves. We don't talk about British values that look to put an end to exploitation and oppression around the world. But that's what our an independent foreign and defence policy needs to be based upon. And in particular, we have to stop this ridiculous Cold War against China. I've been fortunate to be a frequent visitor to China in recent years. For much of the time, I go where I want and I see what I want. I read the English language newspapers that are published in China. I watch some of the Chinese English language television channels. There is nothing like this Cold War propaganda and this war psychosis in their media that we are getting from our state-owned and our big business-owned media. So this brings me, I think, to what kind of defence policy. Of course, every country has the right to defend itself, not the right to slaughter innocent civilians in huge numbers. But of course, if attacked, a country has to have the right and the means to defend itself. But that doesn't require nuclear weapons. That certainly doesn't require a new generation of nuclear weapons at a cost of more than £100 billion if current plans are given the go-ahead, as they certainly will be by a Keir Starmer government. Just think what we could do with those resources. So we maintain our principled position of putting an end to Britain's possession of nuclear weapons, which anyway couldn't be used without the permission of the United States. In fact, we will be told when and where we might have to use them by the United States and NATO, not by any government in London or anywhere else in Britain. We need to have a policy of arms conversion. That's been mentioned earlier by one of the speakers. The huge, utterly corrupt, hugely subsidized armaments industry, nevertheless employs people and equipment of great skill, of great value. Those skills and that equipment could be put to such tremendous use, helping to build up, for example, a civilian defence force against so-called natural disasters, helping other countries that find themselves faced with enormous crises not of their making. We need to reduce our military expenditure to the same average level per head as most European countries, and we need to build our peace movement in Britain to help bring these things about. The Communist Party, we can always do more. We're not perfect, but we've always tried to put the greatest effort into our peace movement here in Britain. CND, Stop the War, Campaign Against the Arms Trade, and so on. And those who've worked with communists in the peace movement have quite frequently and publicly paid tribute to the work that we do. And we're not going to be frightened away from those principled positions by the pro-war propaganda that we are getting from large parts of our media and from virtually every major political party, including, I'm sad to say, the Labour Party. So these are important parts of the 12 points. I'll just mention two others very briefly. The Communist Party, again, I'm sure we could always have done more, but the Communist Party has always stood for the unity of the working class, regardless of people's sex, regardless of people's race, and regardless of people's nationality. And that's a very important principle on which communists stand, together with our socialist and progressive allies in mass movements against racism and so on. It's also why we defend and argue for the national rights of the Scottish and Welsh people, and we want to see a full, genuinely federal system here in Britain. But we also say that can be done without breaking up the working class unity that we've built up in Britain over 150 years and more. So for those reasons, and for the other points in our manifesto, that's why we want people, as many people as possible, wherever they can, and the number of communist candidates is going up by the day. We want people to vote communist and to think about joining the Communist Party. As Nathan said in his splendid contribution, if not now, then when? And if not you, then who? So wherever you can, vote communist on July the 4th.
Thank you for that, Rob, and for your analysis. We are ahead of time, so I think we can answer some questions. So the first one is, how many candidates is the Communist Party standing and where? Lorraine, would you know this?
I don't know the current number. I mean, I think we were up to around about 14, I think, at the last count, but I wouldn't swear to it. Rob might be a little bit more up to date than me.
Well as my own position being clarified, which is, I have to say, quite interesting. It's been the invitations that we've had from non-aligned socialists and from former members, very prominent former members of the Labour Party, that it looks very much as though I will be contesting Blaenau Gwent, traditionally one of the most radical left-wing areas of Wales, the former seat of Aneurin Bevan and Michael Foot. So that's a bit of news. Georgina mentioned it at the beginning, but that will come as news to the rest of the party. I've heard about another contest today. That will go before our weekly political committee tomorrow evening for ratification. So I won't give any details there, but the number continues to grow, although of course there's not much time left. All the formalities have to be completed by this Friday. But we should be in a position even before then to give the final number of our candidates. It will be the biggest general election campaign that the party has run since we had the tragic divisions of the 80s and we had to re-establish the party in 1988. This is the biggest number of general election candidates that we will have had since that time.
Thank you. You can also look on the party's social media, Instagram, Twitter. They're putting some stuff up about our candidates if you want more information. So the next question, I'm going to reframe this a bit. How do you see cooperatives working? I think this is in relation to what you were saying, Lorraine. How do you see cooperatives helping the movement?
Well, the Communist Party traditionally supports cooperatives anyway, in the sense, firstly, that we believe in the working class having the ownership and control of the means of production, since we do the production. And cooperatives are obviously one way of organising people who are involved in production on a collective basis, and in which the fruits of their labour would then be shared. I think what we'd say is that we'd want cooperatives to be genuine, controlled by the people who are working in them and controlled by people who are making use of what they're producing, rather than the organisations that call themselves cooperatives. And I'm thinking of organisations like John Lewis and Waitrose and so on, where the workers in fact have a very different position, I think, to the kind of cooperative organisation that we would look at. So far as rural life goes, we very much support the development of cooperatives on farming, and enabling and supporting farmers to be able to work collectively, so as one to develop really good strategies for food production, but also to give them the mutual aid and support that they need at different times of the year in the food growing and food production process. So yeah, I mean, we would see cooperatives as being part of the pantheon, if you like, of the move towards a socialist means of organising production and labour in the country.
Thank you. So next question. I'm going to put this to Nathan and Judith, maybe I can answer a little bit. What do you think should be done to gain support of young voters?
Well, it definitely is a tough one. I think for a lot of young folk, they've kind of fell out a love of politics. I mean, we can probably thank that to the plight of neoliberalism, the fact it's reaching the youth. I think how we reach young people is actually addressing their needs, like we're doing in the 12-point manifesto here, but not just getting that printed in the manifesto, but the work the Young Communist League is doing, and how we deal with young people there, because it's our future that we've got to fight for, especially in putting my environmental officer hat on now. If we're not fighting to ensure that there's going to be a future, let alone a socialist future, then many young people fall into the idea of doomerism, being very pessimistic and falling out of politics and feeling that there's no way forward, nothing we can do matters. But we know, kind of as a party, as a YCL, historically, these questions have been answered time and time again, when there seemed like there's been doom, when there's been doubt, whether it's been with the Cuban Missile Crisis or whatever other conflict is waged throughout the world. Again, it's been young communists and the Communist Party leaning forward, going, no, you organise today, you organise somebody beside you, and you keep that momentum going forward from your local communities to your district, to your council, to the nation, and build it forward. That's how you secure a future. And I think, as well as that, we do a very good job, I'd like to say, in utilising our history, both as the party and league, as well as the wider movement. I always try to draw it back to young folk about what we can achieve when people say we can't. I mean, for Clydebank, we've got the famous UCS working. That's where I draw a lot of fire. I telling folk the story of shop stewards and young workers going in and saying, no, we're not going to be moved out. We're going to do our jobs and we're going to fight for the right to work. And I put that to young people as well, and other people like my age, and going, take a page out of their book, from the history books, from our history books, the workers' history books, and fight for the right to work, and most importantly, fight for the right to secure a future and to live. So I think that's the real effort that we make, and can only champion even further.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. I also think, there's this talk that a lot of young people are apathetic. I don't think that's necessarily true. Thousands are on the streets protesting Palestine, thousands are doing student encampments up and down the country. Young people are really political, but I think we need to get young people to realise that there's more to politics than just voting in the general election, and that's what we do by building the movement. So the next question is, can people donate to Party Centre in order to help the election? I believe they can. Do you know, Rob?
Well, we have, in fact, even before the election campaign was announced, we launched a big appeal to gather funds for the election. That appeal is still open. It's taken a slight sideline after the general election was announced, because we had even more urgent matters to ensure that we would be fighting the general election. But we're going to resume the work now of collecting money, funding our candidates, funding our campaigns centrally and locally. We did have one major advert in the Morning Star quite recently that explained where donations could be made. We've been putting some information in our internal bulletins as well, but I can assure, I think it's Andrew Northall who's asked, I can assure Andrew you will get every opportunity to make a donation, as much as you can afford, of course. We don't want people bankrupting themselves, but we will resume this work. But if you go to the central website pages, you should find information there of where to donate. But we will need to raise that money, but we've got some good ideas about how to spend it with the maximum impact in our local campaigning for this general election.
Thank you. And yeah, a link's just gone in the chat, taking you to where you can donate. So next question I'll take is, what is party policy in education? Who would like to answer this? Lorraine?
Well, partly coming back actually to the question about what do we offer young people? Well, we have specific policy on the abolition of student fees and writing off student debt. We support the creation of good quality apprenticeships that are going to equip people with the skills that they need to get decent paid jobs. We oppose the discrimination against young people in terms of pay. It seems that the only area where it is legally possible to discriminate against people on the grounds of a protected characteristic is if you're under the age of 24. So from our perspective, these are all important questions. So far as schools are concerned, we oppose academisation. We understand and we see this as privatisation and the handing over of yet more public assets to the private sector. And we see schools being run as businesses. The profits that those academies are making is money that is taken away from student education and children's education, and it's not on. We support free universal childcare for all children and the socialisation of childcare, which we see as beneficial both for children and also for women in particular and families in general, to reduce the level of work associated with domestic labour. Generally speaking, we think that young people have been dealt a really bad deal by not just this government, but in fact over the last 20 or 30 years, since the introduction of tuition fees, and indeed since the loss of maintenance grants under the Thatcher government, and then Blair's introduction of tuition fees, we see as the betrayal of our young people, and the privatisation of higher education as well. We're starting to see universities facing bankruptcy. It's got to stop. We need our institutions, our education institutions, to equip young people with good education. We want smaller class sizes. We want the same quality of education that's afforded to the rich in the private schools. If their average class sizes are 15 to 20 students, well, that should be the case for state educated children as well. Our kids can do just as well as their kids do if they get the same start in life and if they get the same access to resources.
Thank you for that. I'm going to lump two questions together, but in terms of the manifesto and also party policy, what issues to do with culture and the arts are covered, and what are our policies? Who would like to take this one on culture? Rob, and I'll take Nathan.
Well, I'll begin with, I suppose, an apology. You know, we've tried to summarize very, very briefly in a small number of points how we see the major issues of the election and the standpoint of the Communist Party. I'm afraid that the best coverage that we will be giving to this, to the question raised about culture and the arts and so on, will be in the longer version of the manifesto that we'll be issuing. And we will be publishing the resolutions from our last party congress in full. And we had a number of important discussions around cultural issues at that congress. It has played a bigger and bigger part in our deliberations, but I'm afraid, you know, not very much at all got through to the 12 very brief points in the manifesto that we're launching today. Although, of course, there are some general points that would apply very much to the arts and culture. We've seen the devastating impact of austerity on locally funded arts and cultural events and organizations. I can certainly say that here in my area, in Newport and the Gwent Valleys, where a lot of artistic performances that would have been put on by various cultural groups and societies are simply no longer happening because the funding has ceased. And of course, that's part of a bigger question. How do we restore that funding? How do we ensure that we have the kind of taxation policy that will enable us to reinvigorate the arts and cultural activities, which, let's be honest, have never been supported to the extent that they should be supported. But even what little we had has now largely disappeared.
Thank you, Rob. Nathan?
Yeah, just kind of echoing what Rob's saying. I guess there's only so much you can fit in a leaflet there, unfortunately. But when you look at it and you look, as Rob says, the kind of underfunding and the lack of support that, you know, the arts are areas of culture have had, it all kind of comes back to these cuts. It all comes back to austerity. You know, I used to be a football coach a number of years ago. And, you know, when you see the cuts impacting in local football pitches and community hubs, that's when you see working class people being excluded from activity, whether it's physical or intellectual or arts, things like that. That's when they begin to get decimated from it. They lose interest, and then this is some sort of justification furthermore for local councils to then make even further cuts. All of the services aren't being used, but they're not being used because the pitches aren't being kept safe. Opening hours have been restricted, so it's these small tangible things that, you know, decimate slowly into kind of like culture and arts and all that as well. And I think, you know, when we talk about dealing with the cuts, that's kind of simultaneous in how we approach to deal with culture and arts is by rekindling that, making sure we've got facilities open for young people, making sure, you know, like I said earlier, we're fighting you know, for resources with each other. We're constantly fighting amongst ourselves as working people. Couldn't be any more evident up here in Scotland, where, you know, the historic young team scene is what we saw with young people from different areas across Scotland fighting amongst each other for the very little differences between their communities. And, you know, when we talk about dealing with the cuts, it's when we start tackling that, so young people have a place to, you know, not fight against each other, but improve themselves physically and mentally as well.
Thank you. I'll take a quick point, please, Rob.
Yeah, well, you know, communists have always prided themselves on being doers as well as talkers. And it was only a short time ago that communists played the leading role, along with friends and allies, which we always seek to do, in establishing the Culture Matters Cooperative, which has since brought out a stream of books, has taken a whole number of initiatives, some of them working closely with trade unions, in order to encourage cultural activity and to draw more people into cultural activity. So I would urge anybody who's particularly interested in this question to look up the Culture Matters website, for example, and you'll see good examples, great examples of what communists and our allies can actually do in action, as well as just talk about it.
Thank you. I'll leave it there. Thank you for all your questions. If you have any more questions, burning questions, please send them about the general election. Please send them, speak to your branches, districts or nations, or also you can speak to Phil Katz at genelec@communistparty.org.uk about anything general election related. And yeah, do what you can in your branches, districts and nations or localities to support the Communist Party. Get involved in our Red Weekends. And also we'll be having a meeting on Tuesday, the 2nd of July before the general election. So please attend that. So thank you very much and have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.